Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages. It is a great thrill to be back hosting SNL once again. For those of you that turn in early, that's Saturday Night Live. Comes on at 11:30. Oh yes, right, I forgot about that. The world's worst mic. Yeah, it took me a while when I went over to John's house into his closet to get this bow tie. It took a while to find it, but you know, I finally put one of these on, and he takes his off. Let me just give you a little background, folks, on how it is that I happen to be here tonight talking to you about the house at the end of the point. It kind of goes back to my lifelong membership at the B&T, which is it's about 35 years, right? Lifelong? No. Several decades. So I've spent every summer at the B&T, and as we call it, I've enjoyed our $1 million view. And at the same time, part of the view is Coolidge Point, and as well, you know, the house at the end of the point. So I've been staring at that for about 60 years. As a kid growing up there, it held a lot of mystique. It was, back then, it was very dark brown. It had a turret that was very interesting. Obviously, Coolidge Point was very private, so there was no chance of getting up there to see that house. The closest we would get is when we got bored around the club, we'd want to go, you know, we used to tell our parents, you know, can we go climb on the rocks? And the parents would say, sure, just let me know when you get back. That was in the 60s or late 60s. So we did climb the rocks a lot, went out there, got very close, and I will say that at one point, you know, our goal was to get all the way around the point, come back around through the Coolidge property and down what we used to call the secret path, which goes right along Clark Pond and comes out at the end of the beach today, again. And that's exactly what we did, so we achieved that. But fast forward a couple of several decades, some friends of mine that are also members of the B&T happen to be caretakers of the house at the end of the point. And having learned that, I was quite curious, talked to them about that. It got me very interested. Like all of you in this room, I think we're all pretty curious in general, and at the same time, we love history. So I said, gee, maybe I can find out a little bit something about this house. So I started to do research in the wonders of the internet, and found some stuff that the original owner, you know, my friends David and Candy introduced me to the current owner of the house. I sent some photographs that I found, some original photographs, and found out who the original owner was. And then I got immersed into, you know, Coolidge Point in general and the history there. Having gathered a lot of stuff, I got together with the owner and presented a similar program to him at his house. Got to step inside that house, which was a great thrill, having looked at it for 60 some odd years. And that was a ton of fun. And some other folks from Coolidge Point came and enjoyed the presentation as well. The presentation is going to be kind of like 3 parts. And John is here. I have no idea how long this is. John, if this runs a little long, pull the hook, or maybe we'll just stop after the second part of this.
You'll hear from me.
Yeah, I know I will. You did that to me last time. So I was typing, you know, 45 minutes ago, so there was no rehearsal in this. So yeah, it's sort of in 3 parts. And as that description said, it's not only about the house, but I got immersed into the life of the gentleman that was the original owner. And to me, it's a fascinating tale, and we're going to hear about that. It goes beyond New England, but it still has its connections back here to Manchester and Coolidge Point. So without further ado, I should have gone a little further there. That's a shot from the beach club. That's what I've been looking at for many years. Another shot from our deck. You know, you can't beat the sunsets. Here's a quick shot of, obviously, Kettle Cove, Magnolia Harbor, I should say, pointing north towards the club and the beach. Coolidge Point is right over there on the left side. So a little background on Coolidge Point. It's a promontory of 116 acres of spectacular natural beauty. It's surrounded by the Atlantic on 3 sides. For over the past 200 years, it's been known as Millet's Neck, Goldsmith's Point, and also Curtis Farm. Became known as Coolidge Point in 1871. Let's see. I mean, we all know who T.J. Coolidge is, and a little history on it is, you know, back in, on the ownership of the property in 1864, pardon me, a guy by the name of Samuel Cleary sold about 116 acres for $10,000 to Cable Curtis. It then became the Curtis Farm. And then in August of 1871, Curtis sold the land to Coolidge for $12,000. As you can see there, towards the bottom, parcel of land, Manchester, Essex County, Commonwealth, commonly called Millet's Neck, containing an estimation of 116 acres. So thus was born Coolidge Point. Let's go back here a second. I think I missed something. No, I didn't. So this is the fourth lot that was sold on Coolidge Point, and this is the house at the end of the point. The plot was drawn up on August 16th, 1895. A month later, in September, 23-year-old Bulkley Wells signed a deed for the 2 acres. I was able to find a deed that stated it was sold for $1 and other valuable considerations, which tended to be the case with other properties up there on Coolidge Point. Bill Cross gave a great talk that many of you were probably here about a year ago. He covered a fair amount of this stuff. He certainly knows a heck of a lot more about Coolidge Point than I do. So there were 10 early lots sold. This was the 4th lot. This gentleman by the name of Bulkley Wells hired Charles Kimball Cummings to design the house, and construction began in about 6 months. This thing, it's giving me a hard time here on my notes. The architect Cummings was also a very young man at the same time. He was just 25 when he designed the home. He started out with Andrews, Jakes, Rantoul. As we all know, they designed the Essex County Club and also the Bath and Tennis Club in 1912. As you can see, Bulkley's house is mentioned in Cummings' short bio there. So the word got out that this house was being built, and a significant article that extolled its virtues in great detail ran on the June 3rd edition in 1896 edition of the Boston Daily Advertiser. And here's how the article started. Away down on the North Shore, situated upon a neck of land called Coolidge's Point, and 2 miles from Magnolia Station, is now in process of construction one of the most attractive summer residences that can be found anywhere along the Atlantic coast. So that's and an article was also done in an early issue in 1879 in the American Architect and Building News. So there we have the original shot of the house. So we're talking about 122 years ago in 1896. As we can see, the landscaping consisted of thistle, wild brush, and no trees as yet. As we all know, landscaping eventually follows when we all build our summer cottages. So let's fast forward about 120 years and take a quick look of how things have come along. Yeah. The house is came to be known as Kettle Drum, and here's how it looks today. Landscaping has come in nicely, as we see. A total renovation was done in 2007 with the help of local architect Alex Coogan and Windover doing the construction. The owners did a wonderful job of preserving the historical integrity of the original home while making modern day upgrades. That included things such as steel beams that will handle any superstorm that comes our way in the coming years. Here's another look. Just a wonderful house. Here's a quick look inside. Music room to the far right, parlor below that. Dining room den, See that wonderful turret octagon, its den? I mean, we're probably talking a water view from every room in the house in this house. So it's just wonderful. I love the golf closet right there, just in the middle. Essex County Club, here we come. China closet. Here's a quick look inside. As we all know, the houses back then were built very darkly. And obviously, having been in it since the renovation, it looks a heck of a lot better, I have to admit. It's very bright and airy and white. Also with the house, a carriage house was built. And sorry for the bad image here, but on the right it says carriage house. On the left it says stall room. But as we're going to see how the carriage house was originally used in just a little bit, doesn't fit that description. Here's a quick look of how it looks today. The original spire is still there. Let's a little nicer shot with some foliage. There it is as well. So it hasn't changed all that much. And I've got some other older photographs. Here's another angle. But going all the way down to the water with that great walkway. Shot from Shore Road back around the turn of the century. Here's a close-up. House on the left, obviously, is the house at the end of the point. That house you see in the middle was the second house, or third house. Robert Treat Payne built that as a summer residence. Here's a shot from down the rocks towards the beach. You can see the carriage house, which actually looks quite large in that photo. Another shot. Not exactly sure what that is to the right. Some more recent shots from probably from the mid-60s that the current owner supplied. Another one from the close to the water. And here we are, current day. Thanks to the wonderful technology of drones, we get some wonderful aerial shots. You see the B&T in the background. It's just a phenomenal house. So as I mentioned, I started to do a lot of research in the house, and I became quite curious as to who the original owner was. So let's move on to the original owner of the house. As I said, his name was Bulkley Wells, commonly known as Buck. And I like to call this part of the presentation the fascinating life, times, and death of Bulkley Wells. So here we go, folks. We're going to take a slight right turn, but we're still here in Massachusetts for the time being. We might go beyond. So as you can see, he was born in Chicago, came here to Massachusetts, ended up attending Roxbury Latin, and he graduated from Harvard in 1894. Apparently he did quite well at Roxbury Latin. And so during his 4 years at Harvard, Buck seemed to enjoy the limelight quite a bit. As you can see there, he became the president of the Glee Club. He was also a member of the famous Hasty Pudding Club. Noteworthy is the fact that he played the role of Juliet in a Hamlet spoof. The Crimson described his performance as, quote, sustaining the female part and bringing tears to the eyes of all present. But just a few weeks after graduating in May of '94, he became engaged to Grace Livermore from Jamaica Plain. And over the next few years, it would be a very busy time for Buck. His engagement to Grace was a key factor in where his life's journey would take him. And it would take him into the Livermores, who were a very well-to-do family thanks to the success of Buck's future father-in-law, Colonel Thomas Livermore. That's obviously his wife Grace and brother Robert there. So Thomas was born in 1844 up in New Hampshire. He took part in the Civil War, rose to be a very highly regarded and respected colonel in command of the 18th New Hampshire Division. After the war, he established a law practice in Boston, and he also devoted 7 years of his to be a member of the board at the Amoskeag Mills in Manchester, New Hampshire, which at one time was, I believe, the largest cotton mill in the world at one time, probably back in the 1880s. Mr. Livermore also got into mining in 1879, and he made millions during his 21 years as a part owner of the Calumet Hecla copper mine, which produced $155 million in dividends for stockholders over the course of those 21 years. He also became part owner of the New England Exploration Company that was formed in 1898, who were the owners of the Smuggler Union Mill in Telluride, Colorado. So things moved quickly, as I mentioned, after graduating from Harvard in May of 94, I should say, excuse me, that is a typo, May of 1894. As I said, he became engaged to Grace. During that summer, it was noted in the Globe that he was staying at the Oceanside Hotel. Also in that same summer of 94, his future father-in-law got him his first job at the Amoskeag Mills. Buck ended up working there and also at the Boston and Maine Railroad for the next 4 or 5 years. A year later, at the age of 23, he purchased Coolidge, that plot from Coolidge, T.J. Coolidge. A month later, after that, he married Grace and entered into the wealthy Livermore family. So if you do some calendar math here on when he got married, Buck didn't waste a lot of time starting a family as they had their first of 4 children in July of 96. So I'll let you guys work on the math. Let's see. Oops, hold on. Where was I? Hold on a sec, folks. All right. Yes. All right. Nope, that's not good. All right. So here's a quick timeline of how things that happened for Bulkley, how it is that he happened to come to Magnolia and Coolidge Point. To connect the dots, he became engaged to Grace, whose father was on the board at the Amoskeag Mills, of which T.J. Coolidge became the treasurer in 1876. And as you can see in the second blurb, it looks like T.J. hooked him up with the Balches, who built one of the first homes on Coolidge Point, as they had rented there in 1894 and 1895. Did I just show that? I did. Okay. And in the following summer of 1896, they rented a house in Magnolia as their house was being completed. And as we know, during the course of that same busy year, the first of their 4 children, Bulkley Livermore Wells, was born on July 15th, 1896. Here are a few more blurbs mentioning how tremendous their house was going to be. Finally, they moved in and, whoa. My thing just blew up here. So almost 122 years ago, in August of 96, they moved into their new home. Also, during the course of the rest of my research, I learned that Buck had a great passion for breeding dogs, primarily English bulldogs and Boston Terriers, and he put the, shucks, not hitting the right buttons here. Where are we? There we are. He put the carriage house to good use. And here is an ad that ran in the American Kennel Club, the ACK stud book in 1897, you can see the carriage house there. It actually looks a little different than that original photograph, so I'm unsure whether that was quote-unquote photoshopped 122 years ago, because that L, that right corner, is not there. So who knows? Maybe that was added late in the build. So Lord Yarmouth, that nice-looking chap in the upper left, was his most famous bulldog. He was imported from England in 1889 and won what we now know as the Westminster Dog Show Best in Breed in 1897. Buck traveled the country showing his dogs, and shortly after the Westminster Show in June of 97, he held his own happening at the kennels. And here's an article from the Herald back in 1897. This was a big deal. The article stated, Mr. Wells' estate is one of the most sightly and stately homes on the North Shore. Another article said, it is one of the most picturesque events to which dog fanciers have ever been invited, and no more entrancing spot could be found for the open-air sport than Mr. Wells' beautiful estate on the cliffs opposite Magnolia. But as it turned out, Buck and his family's time was very short-lived at Coolidge Point. In just 4 years, in March of 1900, he sold the property to a gentleman by the name of Clement S. Houghton for $43,000. And here's some blurbs for sale and a quick rundown on the ownership. If you think of it, the fact that there have only been 5 owners over the course of 122 years is pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I actually have to revise that comment, because now there is a new owner. Very serendipitously, the current owners, the Burridge family, after 65 years, sold their property today. It closed today. So let's hear it for the Burridges. They've obviously had 65 wonderful years here. And what's that? Some folks by the name of Clements.
Jeffrey Burbank.
Sorry, I'm wrong again. Jeffrey Burbank. Yes, so unfortunately they couldn't be here tonight, but I'm sure they'll watch the video when they get it. But yeah, it's no doubt that it's bittersweet for the Burridges having been in a house so special for 65 years. But there is one silver lining, and that is that they won't have to deal with the Manchester property taxes anytime in the future. So let's see, where are we? Yeah, as it says there, in the lower blurb, Buck went on to purchase a large estate in Needham, which provided more room for the kennels, and perhaps his wife and children wanted to be closer to, her parents and their kids' grandparents in Jamaica Plain. But another likely reason is that Buck's father-in-law gave him a new job. As I had mentioned earlier, Thomas Livermore got into mining, and together with some Boston cronies, formed the New England Exploration Company in 1898, which purchased the Smuggler Union Mill in Telluride, Colorado. They included Rodolphe Agassiz, a high roller with Manchester ties to the Agassiz that we know. Also Henry Lee Higginson, who has pretty deep Manchester summer resident ties, and known among other things as the originator of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So thank you for that, Mr. Higginson. I think you'd probably recognize that's a John Singer Sargent portrait of Mr. Higginson. So they needed someone to run their new mine. So Livermore looked at his son-in-law in the eye and said, "Go west, young man, go west." And so what you see here is one of their stock certificates. You see Buck's name in the lower right, Agassiz's name there on the left. Make a note of that handwriting. We're going to see that again in the future of this presentation. So there you have Smuggler Union Mine in Telluride. Buck went out there in somewhere around 1898, 1899. left his wife and children at home, although they did come and visit every now and again. So something that his father-in-law didn't tell young Buck was that the previous manager at this mine was murdered. That's no joke. Labor unrest was becoming an issue and getting in the way of the Bostonian profits, and Buck was just the right man to take charge, and take charge he did. He established Troop A, the 1st Squadron Cavalry of the Colorado National Guard, which was made up of local merchants, bankers, mine owners, non-union members, to fight the striking union miners. Things got worse as time went on, and the Western Federation of Miners gained strength, and they kept the mines shut down. The guys in Manchester didn't like it, obviously. So it got bad. It got so bad that the Boston heavyweights wanted to play a card from their back pocket. So naturally, what they did is they went to Washington and talked to who apparently is a friend of theirs, and that would be Teddy Roosevelt. What you see here is a letter from, my notes are all messed up, from Mr. Higginson to Teddy in 1903. Mr. President, a young friend of mine, Bulkley Wells, who went from here, is managing our mine in Telluride. He went out to take charge because the agent was shot last year by some miners outside his window. Mr. Wells telegraphs to us as follows: state militia all required for boycott strikes. Governor has therefore asked President for federal troops to send to Telluride. Please ask Higginson and others to urge President to accede. The miners union has armed men, smuggler union mines, and tomboy mine to prevent men from working, and threats are made daily against our lives and property. For 2 years or more ago, the union men went into the mines and murdered various non-union men. A year ago, this agent, an excellent and inoffensive man, was shot in the room as above. Mr. Wells and others are trying to work their property in an orderly fashion and cannot get near them. Mr. Wells has charge of the smuggler union mine, and I, with various friends, have an interest in the mine. Hence this telegram. I'm sure that Wells is the most reasonable and patient, and that he has shown a great deal of courage in taking place of a murdered man, that he is a man of high principles, excellent temper, and is treated with his workmen fairly. There have not been a quarrel about the price of labor, wrong, but control and decency of conduct. I hope very much that you will see fit to stop the violence and allow the industries of the land to go on. If you wish, Mr. Rudolph Agassiz, son of Alexander Agassiz, will go to see you and explain the position. I am respectively yours, Henry L. Higginson. So the boys from Manchester had direct ties to D.C. I do not know the upshot of that letter, but I knew things continued. What I'm showing you here is during his time out there, Buck, as a quick aside, during his time he built what's known as Bridal Veil in Telluride as a summer home, and has since been used as a hydraulic plant. It sits 400 feet up across the highest waterfall in Colorado. There's a couple of other takes. So when you consider his house in Coolidge Point and this one, it seems that Buck has a thing for cliffside living. But back in the mines, things continue to spiral. In January of 1904, as things continue to spiral, he declared martial law, with which he rounded up the strikers and literally shipped them out in trains. Back home, the papers loved what their Harvard boy was doing, and they put together exposés like this. This is a full-page ad, or I should say full-page story in the Boston Sunday Herald. And I'll just read you a couple of the, and they gushed about Buck's successes, his courage, his abundant virtues. So it starts by saying, few heroes of romance have in their careers more that is picturesque than is to be found in that of Bulkley Wells, the newly appointed Adjutant General in Colorado's National Guard, whose office is in Denver, whose residence is in Telluride, whose family and polo ponies are in Colorado Springs, but whose home is in Boston. In a short time, he has been successfully a college athlete, popular member of the Hasty Pudding Club at Harvard, part owner and manager of Smuggler Union Mine and Telluride, a defier of cutthroats, and a marked man of the Western Federation of Miners, captain of Troop A, 1st Squadron Cavalry, National Guard of Colorado, and military commander in one of the 2 centers of Colorado's recent industrial storm, and now the Adjutant General of the National Guard of the Centennial State. Wow. And it goes on from there, as you can see on the right. That was just the first 2 paragraphs. You know, this article goes on and really paints a wonderful picture of Mr. Wells. But back of the mines, things were not going. He was not well liked, obviously, by the miners, and they tried to do something about it. What did they do? The headlines speak for themselves. Miraculously, he came out of this barely with a scratch because he had chosen to sleep on the porch that night. I like the one on the right. General blown sky high. In 1909, the strike comes to an end with the miners finally getting what they want, a paltry $3 a day and an 8-hour work day. So these guys will work pretty hard. Buck would continue to rise, become the president of the mine, as you saw there, the adjutant general of the Colorado National Guard. He also went on to be the president of the American Mining Association and considered quite an expert in mining and engineering. But with his wife and children spending most of their time back in Boston, Buck, to put it nicely, was lonely. So onto the scene, into Buck's life, came a lady by the name of Louise Hill, the social queen of Denver. And basically, so this is like another left turn in the Bulkley, the fascinating lifetimes and death of Bulkley. The queen of Denver's social elite met Bulkley at a polo match. Like Buck, she too was married, but that didn't stop them from having a very long and very public torrid affair. She was Buck's senior by 11 years. Let me just see here. I think I have some notes. The affair was so out in the open that, okay, hold on a second. Let me just read this, get my notes right here. This woman's husband even knew what was going on here. It was very bizarre. And one of the stories I read about this, apparently Crawford Hill not only knew about this, but he tolerated it. For the 3 of them sometimes dined together and occasionally went on trips together. Okay, hold on a sec. But Wells' wife, Grace, was not as tolerant, and in 1918 she divorced him. In 22, Crawford Hill died, and since they were now both single, Louise thought Buckley would marry her. Instead, he eloped with a blonde divorcee from Nevada. And an irate Louise was heard to say, "I'll break him." Using her social and political contacts, she got many of his financial backers to withdraw their support. But to roll it back here a second, sometimes designed together and occasionally went on. In the foyer of her mansion, Louise hung a large picture of Crawford on one wall, but an even larger picture of Bulkley on the left wall. Take a look, folks. Bulkley on the left, her poor husband up there at the top. How bizarre is that? But this woman was not happy when this all went down, and she wanted to go out of her way and take Bulkley down. So it kind of started, here's something from, 1923. It's at this point that things are on their way down for Buck. He loses a major backer. He gambles his money. Did not fare well with future speculations. In 1926, the price of gold and silver started to tank, and the country, as we know, is headed for the crash of '29. Buck was a lot of things to a lot of people, and from the Boston Herald, you saw that, how they extolled his virtues, but obviously the guys, in the mine didn't care for him very well, and there were I came across a lot of descriptions of Buck that kind of sum up who he was, and here are just some of them. A handsome, high-living, bed-hopping, scandalous glamour boy of Colorado, the virtual dictator of San Miguel County, a courageous and glamorous man, a peacock all spangled, spurred, and armed with a pistol, Rudo Valentino, good looks, a man of high principles and excellent temper, a gentleman and a savage, a shitheel Ivy League smoother, and I had to Google shitheel just to see exactly what it was, and it is out there. A jackal in charge of the hen coop, polite but lethal, one of the most glamorous and controversial managers in the entire West, and a man of reckless courage. This is what Buck has risen to. It looks like he really savored being able to wear that uniform and probably carry a gun. But things went downhill in 1931 when he was down and out, and he asked his buddy, a gentleman by the name of A.D. Snodgrass, who was with him all the way back to the Smuggler Union mine as a bookkeeper, and followed him out to California. Buck asked him for $20, and he ran out to the bank, and by the time he got back, he had shot himself. And here's a note. This is the actual note that was found. Dear A.D., as a result of all my difficulties and worries, I feel that my mind is bound to go, either that or by stroke, and I will not be a charge upon anyone. Nothing but bankruptcy is possible as far as my estate is concerned. Do what you can for Mrs. Wells. Kind of sad. That made the papers, obviously, because he was, So those were the last words from a man who had graduated from Harvard, built a beautiful home in Coolidge Point, rose to the heights of the mining industry, the Denver social life, achieved extreme wealth, and fell into total disrepair with not a penny to his name. After his death, his brother-in-law was stated, "It would be relatively easy to turn the life of Bulkley Wells into an operatic melodrama." And as you can imagine, as I'm doing my research and learning more and more, I'm just getting sucked into this man's life, and eventually come upon, his ending. And it's quite sad. So that's, there's been a lot of books written in which Buck has been mentioned. And I've only scratched the surface of what went on there at the mines back at the turn of the century in Colorado and elsewhere in the country. That's when, the workers really started to stand up and get a reasonable wage and treated fairly. Interestingly enough, in my continuing research, one book in particular caught the attention of a gentleman from Hollywood, rightly so, as I would think. The book called The Corpse on Boomerang Road. I found an article that said about 5 years ago a gentleman bought the rights to it, and his name is Evan Green, and he purchased the movie rights to the book, and he's written a screenplay and a movie, as well as a 10-part miniseries, one or the other, titled Undistinguished Citizen. And the movie focuses obviously on good versus evil, primarily the good guy, a gentleman who was Buck's archenemy, Vincent St. John, who headed up that union federation. But as you can see, I chatted with Evan. We had a nice chat. This thing's sort of been sitting for him because he's trying to find some backers. He's trying to turn it. He's like, Hollywood these days doesn't really like, Westerns. He said, so it's a tough sell. But I'm hoping he can. And there's part of the actual script at the top there, Livermore, not current. But remember, there are no guarantees when we blast into the earth. Without owner risk, there are no mines to demand pay increases from. And Buck says, the whole of my attention will be dedicated to protecting the investment of the New England Exploration Company. I don't reward failure, Buck. Don't make me regret this. So the start of a wonderful father-in-law, son-in-law relationship. So yeah, well, we'll see what happens with Evan and this script. I think it would make a great movie, without a doubt. Let us move on to, quote unquote, part 3 of sorts, and a little more history. Well, let's bring it back to Coolidge Point. We've taken a ride across the country, and let's get back to Coolidge Point. I'm going to just quickly go through some maps and some info and photos. Here's the map from 1879, or actually 1871, and that was the year that TJ bought the property. And interestingly, at the top of this page, you see in big letters Kettle Cove. As we know, things were quite different back then. I mean, Coolidge Point was considered Magnolia for many, many years. And Kettle Cove is obviously Manchester. So after TJ bought a couple of years later, he put up his first house. And you're going to recognize some of these images because Bill Cross showed these about a year ago in his presentation. It was the first of the family's cottages, known as the mansion house. And what I'm going to show you next is, here's a list of the original owners. A gentleman by the name of James Freeman Clark in 1879. The Balches, Ernest Longfellow and his wife Harriet. Bulkley, that you see there in 1895 was the fourth. Fosters, I'm sure many of you know. Sutherlands, Paynes, Aspinwalls, Fessendens. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the Fessendens have a direct relation to the Roosevelt family, maybe on an in-law basis. If we move on to the next slide, you see the Bulge House listed there. This is 1884. You see the J.F. Clark there. That's actually the first house that was built over by the pond, now known as Clark Pond, rightly so. There are a few of the houses, once again, I think I showed that earlier. That's the Bulge House on the right. The second house built on the point after James Freeman Clark. Obviously, TJ was the first built. If we move on to 1899, you see Bulkley's house mentioned there and name listed. You see Reginald Foster. You see the Sutherlands, J.F. Clark. Square in the middle at the bottom is Robert Tree Payne's house. Also shown as Goldsmith Point. If we fast forward a couple, this one, after Clement Houghton sold the house, he sold it, as we know, to the Fosters. So this is, I don't know where I got this map, but obviously it's been filled in a little bit with structures and notes. On the bottom left there, George Willett built a house. He happened to be the first president of the Bath and Tennis Club, back then known as the North Shore Swimming Pool. So if we go on to 1910, that's where you see Clement Houghton at the bottom right there, who had bought it from Bulkley, Foster's. Sutherlands. So here's after the Houghton sold Kettle Drum to Harriet and Reginald Foster. So they had a large piece of property there with their properties. And eventually they would end up selling to the Burridges in 1953. Another shot of the houses. The Bulge House there is very much the same. I knew the Bromleys that lived there. So that house is pretty much stuck with it. The house obviously on the right is long gone. That was a Sutherland house. I think I showed that already. Septingle, first house by James Freeman Clark. And that's the mansion house in the background on what's known as Bungalow Hill. It's kind of a weird perspective. That shot's taken from one of the Magnolia hotels and super zoomed in. It was called Septangle because of seven chimneys in the house. At least that's what I've learned. James Freeman Clark was a social reformer and Unitarian minister, well known in Boston, a friend of TJ's. It seemed like a lot of these folks all had a connection to TJ in some fashion, whether as a friend or business. This is what the Bulge House known as Thorncliffe. This is the house that the Fosters own. Home was built in 1883. As I mentioned, owned by the Fosters and the Bromleys. And another shot of the Bulge House when it was one of the only ones there, and a barn that I don't think is there anymore. So the house was sold back in 1892, or sold or rented, I should say. Little blurb in the paper there. If we move on, I believe the third house was the lot was purchased back in 1885 by Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow and Harriet. The name of that house is Edgecliff. So we have Crowncliffe, Thorncliffe, Edgecliff, son of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was quite a prominent landscape painter. Here's a quick look at their home and a few interior shots as well. Once again, a very dark house. Lots of paintings, lots of wall art. The Sutherlands bought I think the 6th lot in 1897. That was that big house that we saw on the right. They call this home Crowncliffe. So now we have Thorncliffe, Kettlecliff, Edgecliff, Crowncliffe. Here's another shot of Crowncliffe, which, as I mentioned, is no longer there. I'm not too sure when that was taken down or burned. Moving on to Kettlecliff by Robert Treat Payne. Another acquaintances of TJ's. He and his wife Hannah purchased the 2nd lot. They built what would be called Kettlecliff, and he's a direct relation to the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Here's a shot of their house, once again looking from one of the big hotels in Magnolia. That's the best shot I could find. And we all know the Marble Palace in 1902 at the direction of T.J. Coolidge Jr. Charles McKim designed the next Coolidge residence. Built on what's known as the Ocean Lawn and completed in 1904, it was, quote, pure example of the best Georgian architecture, unquote, and constructed primarily of brick, but was known as the Marble Palace for its marble foundation and extensive embellishments. I'm sure you have seen these pictures that I'm going to show you, but it's always great to see them again. This house was taken down in the late 50s. I don't have the square footage for you folks, but I'm sure it's quite significant. Written up in the papers quite frequently. This is 1905, shortly after it was built. The house will be magnificently furnished. Much of the fittings have been made to order. So this is T.J. Coolidge's son's house. Let's fast forward to 1936, and they're still speaking about it. It was used over the years. Some folks consider it a summer White House for various presidents. Here are a few more shots. From the newspaper, and then we can see the actual photograph taken of this loggia. Better shot of the interior, the oval living room as it was known. And Mr. Coolidge Spent a lot of money on his Italian gardens that became quite famous. Quick shot of that. I won't get into others. Here's an interesting shot. If you look towards the middle there, that's the ocean lawn, as they call it. You're going to see an outline that remains of the mansion right there in white. I don't have my pointer, so I think you can see it. On the far right is the Robert Treat Payne house that we looked at. Another shot of the ocean lawn. Once again, going back as a kid, one of the myths was that T.J. Coolidge's ashes were in these. So lots of myths back then growing up. You know, that lawn was over, or probably still is, you know, over 700 feet long, you know, from the house down. The house was demolished in '58, and then the Coolidges offered the land to the trustees of reservations in the early '90s. So we're all thankful for that that gift. So a good 60 acres of that, 116 acres will forever in perpetuity be enjoyed by any and all of us and those coming down the road. So the Coolidge Point, you know, over the years, you know, it was not only just rest and relaxation. You know, some serious business took place, and you know, in addition to what, you know, the Honorable T.J. Coolidge, as the Minister of France, was involved with, and influential people came to Coolidge Point over the years, presidents, diplomats, princes even, as you see there. Colonel House had a house, a cottage on the point, and he was a very close confidant of Wilson, and he summered on Coolidge Point for about 10 years, starting in like 1907. And the president was a frequent guest to Coolidge Point because of that fact. Let's just see here. Yeah, and that loggia picture that I showed you, together they drafted the covenant for the League of Nations on that. So yeah, some serious business went on at Coolidge Point over the years. And there's a shot from in 1939, T.J. Coolidge Jr.'s son William hosted the Crown Prince and Princess to celebrate her 16th birthday. So, one last shot. Thank you very much, folks, for the house at the end of the point. My pleasure.
He did it.
I did it. I did it.
And it was very interesting,
Thank you.
well-researched. We really appreciate it, David. Come
Thank you,
back
John.
again, will you?
I will,
All right.
as long as you'll have
Thanks,
me.
everybody.
Thank you.